Hi there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. Well, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Twin Sisters Quilt Block pattern that I found in Barbara Brackman's encyclopedia. I saw this pattern and I thought, oh, this would be an easy thing to make. Here you see a drawing I did where I thought, well, if I did a dark strip, a light strip, and another dark strip, and then I cut the triangles out, would that work? The short answer to that question is no. I did try it. I did cut out a few triangles and put them together, and that was a disaster. Next, I made strip sets with 2.5-inch strips, and then I cut those out to size and stitched them back together. Now this looks great, it looks fantastic, very pretty, but it's not exactly what I was going for. I really wanted those seams to meet in the middle, just like the twin sisters in my encyclopedia. Well, I pulled up the pattern, which already is existing in EQ8, my software program, pulled it up and I loaded it in and I colored the pattern. And then I rotated some of the blocks around various ways and I came up with this pattern that I just love. EQ8 allows you to print this pattern as a rotary cutting pattern, or in my case, I just love foundation paper piecing, so I created it as a foundation paper pieced pattern. That pattern is available on my Etsy shop and I'll leave a link in the description. Here's a look at the pattern. The first page, you can see I've got the title, I've got A plus B equals complete. Pretty simple, easy block to make. To make this pattern, I wanted to use 16 total blocks. Now I designed this as a 12-inch block, and then later I went back and added 2 pattern pages to make a 9-inch block for those who don't want to make a giant size block. I'm showing a couple of different colorways here and also some coloring sheets for those who like to take a little colored pencil and color in some ideas. You could also cut those little blocks out and flip them around different ways. The pattern for one block takes 4 pages. And remember, I did add 2 pages to this pattern for a 9-inch block. Now, one other option, if there's a size that you want to print, you can print your PDF file to any percentage. I printed this to 60%. You can see how small it is. It still takes 4 pages to print it out though. Well, let's get started putting this block together. The first thing I do is cut apart my sections. In this block, there are only 2 sections, A plus B equals a complete block. There are 4 pieces to each section. So there are 4 pieces of fabric for section A, 4 for section B, and then put all that together and you have a complete quilt block. Now this is such a large quilt block at a 12-inch size. Obviously it's going to overrun 8.5 by 11-inch paper. There is a little trick I use to put these together. The EQ8 pattern prints with guidelines already on the paper. The way I put these together, I cut a little zigzag. My zigs and my zags are on either side, on both sides of that line that EQ8 has drawn for me to join these blocks together. Then all I have to do is line up the guideline and put some tape on it. And the way the pattern is drawn, it's pretty easy to tell which triangle goes on which section. I printed off enough pattern pieces to make 17 blocks. I only need 16 blocks for my quilt, but I wanted to have an extra, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. On my extra, my 17th printout, I took the time to write all the piece numbers, all the piece colors. So you can see on this piece, I've got green, I've got my color 1 is tan, color 3 is my blue, and then I've got my B color for background fabric. You'll notice that there are 2 triangles for background fabric on each section, total of 4 per block. My tan fabric, which is going to be color 1, I've got 1 piece of that per section, 2 pieces per block. Then my blue, I only need 1 piece per block, and my green, I only need 1 piece per block. So we'll recap the colors. I've got this white scrap of fabric that I'm going to use for that background, those small triangles. I've got this tan check I'm going to use, and then I've got this blue and this green, and those I picked up at an estate sale not too long ago. Well, now I'm going to take this extra block that I printed and wrote all over, and I'm going to cut out these pattern pieces with no seam allowance. So that dotted line is the seam allowance, the straight line is the sew line. So I am just going to cut each piece out. With that done, I know that I need 16 of each one of these 8 pieces. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that a lot of these pieces are exactly the same size. So my green is the same size as my blue. My 2 tan pieces are exactly the same. And then my 4 little triangles that are the background fabric, they are also exactly the same size. The next thing I did was do a little measuring. I was thinking to myself, well, these triangles could go together to make a square. I could cut out oversized squares and just cut them diagonally in half, and boom, I will have pattern pieces ready to sew. I recommend adding about 3/4 of an inch on all sides of these pieces because that gives you a little bit of wiggle room when you assemble this pattern. Since I'm making 16 blocks and they each need 4 of these little triangles, I need a total of 4 times 16 little triangles, but I only need half that many squares. So I did cut out that many squares. For the tan fabric, I need 2 pieces per block. Well, looky there. I put them together this way and I see that I can just cut a strip of fabric and then cut some diagonal lines. So I figured out how wide to make my strip. And then I just went through and cut diagonal lines down my strips. And I did a little calculation to figure out how many pieces I am going to need for 16 blocks. For the blue and the green fabric, I need half as many as the tan, so it was pretty easy to do my calculation. But I'm still going to cut them from long strips of fabric. I started cutting strips from my white scrap background fabric. Once I had cut out all the strips, I just laid these down and I cut out my oversized squares and cut a diagonal line down the middle until I had a total number of triangles that I needed. Next, I cut the tan fabric into strips. Once all my strips were cut, I laid out my fabric. Now here is where it's important. If you have a right and a wrong side of fabric, your pattern pieces are face up. Your fabric should be right side down, wrong side up. And here you can see I'm just cutting a diagonal line to give myself a generous seam allowance on all 4 sides of this pattern piece. Once I had 32 of the tan pieces, I cut out my 16 pieces of blue fabric, and then I cut out my 16 pieces of green fabric. I almost ran out of this blue scrap, but I was able to sew a couple of pieces together and that solved the problem. When I had everything cut out, I used those pattern pieces to make little stacks of my fabric. So I had a pattern piece on top of the tan, the green pattern piece on top of the green, and the blue and the backgrounds, just so I would be ready to start sewing my pattern together. So I'm going to start putting this section together. I'm going to start with piece 1 and piece 2, put those together. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to be putting them right sides together on the back of the pattern so that they overlap a seam allowance worth of the stitch line. And you can see that I've folded back this, on this stitch line, I've folded back and I can see that my fabric does overlap that stitch line. And I can also see that the edges of the fabric overhang the outside of the block. So with my stitch length set to 1.8 or less, I'm stitching on that stitch line, stitching a couple of stitches before, a couple of stitches after the stitch line. Then I will trim away any excess thread, excess bulk, and then I will press that open. Once I had that pressed down, I was ready to add piece 3, which is my tan fabric. Now I'm making sure that's right sides together on the back of the pattern, making sure everything overlaps, making sure the seam line is overlapping and the edges of the pattern piece are overlapping. Then I'm going to stitch right down that stitch line. Once I had piece 3 pressed flat, it was time to add that last little background triangle. Now I noticed my tan fabric overlaps that stitch line quite a bit, so I made a little fold on it. That way I could tell exactly where to lay my little background triangle. And once I press that seam open, our section will be complete. Now the way I decided to do these, I did all the sections with blue in them together. So I did all 16 blue sections. Then I went back to the stacks and I did all the green sections. We've gone through 2 sections at a slower pace. Let's skip ahead to the end of sewing all these sections together. Now it's time to trim all of my sections, and for 16 blocks I've got 32 sections, 16 green, 16 blue. They're going to go together to make a beautiful block. But first we need to trim them on the dotted line, which is our seam allowance. Now 2 corners of each triangle have notches, and that makes it easier to match up when we stitch these 2 parts together. The edges of the 2 sections that I'm going to stitch together are cut on a straight edge, so there's not really a problem with stretching when I sew the blue section to the green section. But you will notice that the outside edges of the square are all diagonal cut edges. They could tend to stretch. I am going ahead and removing my paper because I'm going to be very careful about the stretching. I'm going to clip my seams. I'm not going to be pulling or tugging as I put these through the sewing machine. If you're a little worried about the bias, if you're worried about stretching, or you're a beginner, I would suggest leaving the paper on until you stitch a couple of squares together and then remove it later. To sew the 2 sections together, I only need to match up that center seam. So I'm going to go ahead and put these together. I'm going to nest that seam, and then I'm going to put a clip on it, make a large stack of all my blocks, and take them to the sewing machine all together. Once I had all the squares stitched together, I took my pattern piece and I folded it back where I could really keep close track of what I was sewing together to make sure I didn't mess up. All my blocks are identical. It's just a matter of figuring out which 2 sides of the block go together. So I kept referring back to my pattern. I clipped each set of 2 blocks together to make sure it was going to be the right orientation. And you'll notice I'm clipping that center seam where they need to match, and every once in a while I will open that up just to verify that where my stitch line is going to be, it's going to make a nice matched up seam. Now once I had them all in sets of 2, I'm referring back to my pattern again to complete each row of 4, making sure my orientation is correct. Once all 4 rows were complete, I started clipping 2 rows together, and again I'm trying to make sure that everywhere that needs to match is matching, because this Twin Sisters block, it can make a beautiful pattern based on the rotation of the block, but those center seams do need to match. And the last thing I'm doing is I'm stitching the top 2 rows together with the bottom 2 rows to complete this quilt top. Well, I think this quilt top is just gorgeous. I cannot wait to finish it and get it quilted. I did not plan this, but if you look at the quilt top overall, it has an almost satin look to it because of that beige fabric against the white fabric. It gives it kind of a sheen. I want to thank you so much for joining me today for this lovely quilt. I hope to see you back again real soon.